us. My name is Rose McClure, and I'm here with Angie Summer, and we're going to be presenting today's webinar. Thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties and the late start time. So typically when we do these presentations in person, we like to poll the audience to see who has heard about the project or seen a presentation of our findings. But since we are doing this over webinar today, we don't have the means to collect this feedback. So we're just going to go ahead and assume that nobody in the audience does know anything about this. So here's an outline of today's presentation. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about the project background and how we originated. Then we'll cover some of the demographics of our survey findings. We'll spend the majority of the time talking through the things that we found as part of our survey and wrap up with some lengthier discussion about best practices that were developed as a result of the study. So first off, what is SE3? SE3 stands for Structural Engineering, Engagement, and Equity. And it is a group of about 20 to 30 SEONC members, that's the SBA of Northern California, that was originally sponsored by SEONC as a women's initiative. And it was sponsored by SEONC in 2015, and it quickly grew into a full-blown employee engagement retention study. We were inspired as a group by two previous studies, one that was conducted by the AIA called Equity by Design, and they conducted a study in 2014 and then repeated one in 2016. And another study that was done specifically for structural engineers by the younger professional group of ASCE-SEI, the Structural Engineering Institute. And that one was done in 2013. So the goals of this committee and this group were primarily to implement a survey of structural engineers on employee engagement and equity. Secondarily, we wanted to understand the reasons why men and women leave our profession, and we wanted to raise awareness or start conversation about gender equity in the workplace. Finally, one of our goals initially was to establish this list of best practices that firms can adopt to improve engagement and retention within their companies. So here's a brief timeline of the project. As I said, it started in 2015. And the 2016 study for which we are presenting the findings on today was started way back in 2015, and the survey construction began in the fall. But before that, I think it's important to note that our group started with a lot of outside research. There's a wide range of studies being conducted on the topic of engagement and gender equity, not only in our profession, but across professions within the United States at this time. And so we really wanted to amass all of this information before, in order to inform our research questions before beginning down this path. So we conducted the study in early 2016, analyzed the data last summer, and started presenting the findings last fall. And since then, we have issued a report just at the end of last year, and we have several ongoing tasks that we're working on right now in subcommittees and subgroups that we will share with you all at the end of today's presentation. Lastly, I just want to mention that we are planning to conduct a repeat study in 2018, and some of this is going to involve input and contributions from SEA groups across the country, not only in California. And we're hoping to see more participation in that study from places like Illinois. So let's talk briefly about how the survey was distributed. In all, we received over 2,100 responses from across the country, although half of the responses were focused in California, did come from within California. The primary means by which we distributed the survey was through the member organizations of SEA. And so organizations like yours, we definitely reached out to, but as we mentioned, we had most of our responses coming from within California. And that's because we conducted a focused distribution effort within California to any company that had a presence within the SEA membership within California. Here's a snapshot of, so after we received and collected all of the data, we as a committee hired an independent consultant to analyze our data. And here is a sample of the type of output that she produced for us. We mention this because everything that we are going to present on today and what's written up formally in our report we don't talk about p-coefficients or statistical significance, but it's important to note that all the findings we will be presenting today are statistically significant. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Angie to start talking about the survey demographics.
Hey everyone, so I'll just run you through who responded to our survey last year. So as Rose touched on before, we did have over 2,100 respondents throughout the country. You can see on the map here where most of our respondents were in California. Just about half of them were from California due to our distribution efforts that Rose touched on. The next highest states that responded were Colorado, Texas, and New York with about 150, and I think Illinois was pretty close right up there as well, just under that. In terms of age, you can see about half of our respondents were under the age of 35, and we actually found that that's actually pretty common for online surveys, is that younger people respond to them, not the most surprising thing. But we did also get a significant number of people sort of, in later years in their career, so we were pleased about that. When you break down the age of our respondents by gender, you can see that at each age range there are fewer women than men. The women are in yellow bars and the men are in teal. So you can kind of see, and especially as you advance to older engineers, that there are fewer women present. And in terms of women, just overall, we received, of our respondents, 29% of them were women and 71% were men. We actually thought that that was a good response as it was pretty indicative of the ratio within the industry, not exactly indicative, but at least more heavily weighted toward men, which allowed us to make comparisons based on gender that informed our study, which was helpful. So when we asked people to choose a position title that defines their current position, and we gave people 5 options. These were 5 options as defined in ASCE guidelines, and because at each different company they're all not called, we all have our own special names for our positions at our companies, but we had a list of the tasks and responsibilities that you would perform as part of that role, and so based on that we asked you to choose one of 5. So you can see in this chart here that we actually got a pretty good distribution among the 5 roles of respondents to our survey, and we actually did get almost 400 principals as well, which we enjoyed. And just as a note, if you haven't heard this before, this is not a Venn diagram. I know we're all engineers, so our graphic designer set this up and we were like, yeah, we're all gonna think that's a Venn diagram. It's not. In terms of degrees achieved and licenses received, we asked everybody that question as well. You can see about 75% of our respondents had a bachelor's degree in structural engineering, and then obviously the higher degree, there are fewer and fewer people that have those. Same with licenses, a little over 3/4 of people had an EIT certificate, a little under 3/4 had a PE license. It goes up as you get into the SE licenses. Notably, SE licenses aren't a thing in all states in the country, but they are in California, which was, half of our respondents. So, of the people that we surveyed, so 93% of them were still working as structural engineers. 7% of them had left the industry or left the profession to do something else, and that's shown in the chart on the upper left. In the lower right, you can see that those 7% of our respondents, which amounts to 146 people, of those people, 21% were currently unemployed, and just under 80% were employed in a different industry. When we asked people if they had children or not, you can see that just over half of our respondents did have children or dependents. And when you break that down by gender, men were far more likely to have children than women. 57% of our male respondents had children, while only 38% of our women did. And so now we're just going to go into our key findings from our study, which is organized into 4 categories, and this is how our report is broken down as well, which are overall satisfaction, career development, pay and benefits, and work-life balance in children. So Rose and I will just walk you through these different sections, and I'll let Rose start with overall satisfaction.
Thanks, Angie. Okay, so first thing we are going to talk about is overall career satisfaction. We asked the survey respondents, how satisfied are you with your choice in career? And the response was overwhelmingly positive, with over 80% of our respondents saying either satisfied or very satisfied. This diagram here shows that we're doing way better than our architect friends. The snapshot is taken from the 2014 Equity by Design survey, and you can see that only 28% of women architects in that study indicated that they were satisfied, and 41% of male architects indicated that they were satisfied. So we're doing much better than they are in terms of overall satisfaction. But we did conduct other studies and find that these numbers, around 80%, are in line with other professions in the United States today. Now, we also asked about satisfaction with a number of different metrics, not just satisfaction, overall satisfaction. And we found less satisfaction reported from our survey takers, specifically in the areas of career advancement, pay and compensation, and work-life balance. And so that's why we chose to organize our key findings around those three topics. We also asked whether our survey respondents had considered leaving at any point in their career, and we found that over 50% of them have considered leaving at some point. If you're interested to see how this varies by gender, the diagram on the right shows that women are slightly more likely to consider leaving than men, 63% versus 53%. Here we have a ranked list of reasons why men and women have considered leaving the profession. So Angie pointed out in the demographic section that the majority of the responses that we collected were from people who are currently working in our profession. However, and that was about 2,000 people. However, we did receive about 150 responses from people who have, quote unquote, left the profession, or we call them exits. And so on the left-hand side, you have the ranked reasons from the 2,000 people who have considered leaving, and on the right-hand side, you have the ranked reasons for people who have actually left. And what we'll find on the left-hand side is that women and men actually agree on their top 3 reasons. They just rank them slightly differently. So women tend to care about a little bit more about work-life balance, and men tend to care a little bit more about pay. Other reasons that make the list are time with family, loss of interest, and more fulfillment. Now, if we go over to the right-hand side and look at the reasons that people who actually left cited for leaving, we see a lot of the same reasons given here. But one notable exception that was pretty high up on the list for both men and women was poor management and leadership. So with this enormous data set that we collected, we had the means to compare and correlate any number of variables that you might expect with overall career satisfaction. And when we did that, we found that these 3 variables correlated very strongly with career satisfaction. And they are job position title, having children, and having daily tasks in line with your career objectives. So for job title, this is kind of to be expected. The higher up you are in your firm, the more satisfied you are with your career overall. Having children, this was somewhat unexpected by the committee. I suppose that having children may make you appreciate what you have at home and what you have at work and separate those 2 more. And so that's one potential explanation for why this correlated strongly with satisfaction. And the last one, daily tasks in line with your career objectives. This seems to make a lot of sense. If you have a clear vision of what you want out of your career and what you do on a daily basis seems to be in line with that, then it makes a lot of sense that this would correlate strongly with satisfaction. Okay, so to summarize the key findings in this category, most of the engineers that we surveyed were generally satisfied with their choice in career. However, there is room for improvement, specifically in the areas of pay, work-life balance, and career advancement. Men and women agree on their top 3 reasons for considering leaving the industry, but ranking does vary slightly by gender. And finally, the people who have actually left cited poor management as an additional reason for leaving the profession.
Great, so I'll take us through the career advancement section. So starting off, we asked people a variety of questions as we've discussed, and we did find that there were a few things where firm leadership there was a bit of a disconnect between them and the rest of the staff. And 3 of them are noted here. So firm leadership, specifically principals and owners, were actually 43% more likely to believe that expectations for advancement were clearly defined to their staff. Principals and owners were also 24% more likely to believe that advancement opportunities were equal for all staff. And this is, I'm comparing principals and owners to the rest of the staff in these statistics. And principals and owners were also more likely to believe that formal business training is not necessary as compared to the rest of the staff who thought it was a bit more important. So you can see here, that management tends to think one thing about a few items, and the rest of the staff often think something slightly different, which, can end up being an issue, especially if you consider that one of the reasons we said that we found that people had actually left the industry was poor management. So, perhaps there could be room for improvement in this category. We also asked people about mentorship, and we did find that mentors were important. People without mentors were noted to be 22% more likely to consider leaving the structural engineering profession. They were also noted to be less satisfied with their career choice and less satisfied with advancement. So, that led us to believe that mentorship was just a really important thing that helped people throughout their careers. Regarding our actual respondents, about half of them noted that they had significant mentors in their lives, and of those people who said they had mentors, men and women were equally likely to have mentors. When we looked at advancement and we broke it down by gender, we actually found that women respondents advanced to their current positions faster than men for all positions except for principal. So you can see on the chart on the left here for the senior engineer position, for example, it took women on average 9 years to reach that position, while it took men on average 10.8 years to reach that position. So that was true at all levels except for principal, where you can see it took women 15.5 years and men 14.7 years on average. It's also worth noting that there were far fewer women at the higher position levels, which is shown on this slide here. This breaks down men and women at each position in our study. So you can see at the staff entry level we had about 39% women, and when you get up to principal, we only had 16% women. Another thing that we asked people is, what is the highest level, position level that you would aspire to be in your career? And you can see that what this chart shows is that when we break that down by gender, women, who are in yellow and men are in teal, women were generally less likely to aspire to principal than women at every position in their career. So for example, people who just started out with fewer than 5 years of experience, only 45% of women aspired to be principal, whereas 60% of men were aspiring to be principal. So that's an interesting note as well. And just summing up some of the key findings in the career advancement section, we discovered that there was a disconnect between how managers and staff perceive their work environments. We also found that there was value in mentorship, and that structural engineers who don't have a mentor are more likely, 22% more likely, to consider leaving the profession. And we also found that female respondents advance more quickly than men to all levels except for principal. And finally, we did note that there were far fewer female respondents at the higher position levels.
Okay, so moving on to pay and benefits. This is a section that everybody enjoys hearing about, and if we'll dive right into it, we find that across the board, whenever we're presenting this pay section of findings, everybody has this tendency to go straight to their position level and to compare what they're being paid to what the average is based on our findings. And that's the true value in compensation data, right? And so you can see here that this is our pay data broken out by position level. And you'll see that on average, people who identified at staff entry level are making about $65K a year. And on average, people who identified as principals or owners are making about $175K a year. Now, it's important to remind you here that over half of our respondents are from California, and so sometimes when we present this in different parts of the country where the cost of living is not as high, our audience is certainly alarmed by some of these numbers and are wondering where the heck we collected this data from. However, I think it's easily explained based on the high cost of living and the corresponding slightly higher pay that we receive in California. Another thing that we want to point out is how income was actually defined in our survey. So the wording of the question was debated and revised multiple times, but the final question came out as follows. we asked for your annual income with typical values of bonuses received. And so when you're looking for pay data, you can ask for an hourly rate, you can ask for salary versus annual income that's being reported in your taxes, you can ask for information with and without bonuses or with and without overtime. So you can see why we debated this heavily, and that's the definition that we ended up with. So moving on, here is a similar plot, but it is plotted against the number of years experience for all of our respondents. And you can see that for people who have less than 3 years of experience, they are again being paid around $63K a year. And then this plot maxes out at about $164K for people who have 30 to 34 years of experience. Another thing that we looked at related to pay is compensation for overtime. And what we found is that almost 50% of our respondents do receive compensation for overtime, and they do so in a few different forms. They either receive straight pay for overtime work, or they receive comp time, or they have the option for either. And so almost 50% of our respondents do receive compensation in some form for overtime work. Another thing that's interesting to note here is that people who do receive compensation for overtime work on average 2 fewer hours per week than people who do not receive compensation. And so if you're an employer who's listening in onto this, you might be thinking, wait a second, why would I pay my employees more to work less? Something doesn't seem to add up here. But before you pass judgment on this, let's talk about the numerous benefits of paying employees for overtime. One is that structural engineers who receive compensation for overtime are 20% more likely to report being satisfied or very satisfied with their pay than people who don't receive this. And there's this effect of burnout that we were able to measure in our data, which means that for every additional hour worked over 40 hours a week, the odds of an employee considering leaving are 4% higher. So if an employee works on average 44 hours per week, they are 16% more likely to consider leaving than somebody who works 40 hours a week on average. So this is a pretty significant effect that we found in our data. Let's move on to talking a little bit about the gender pay gap. So here we have, again, the same plot which is annual income versus years of experience for all respondents. And what you'll see is that on the left-hand side of the graph for fewer years of experience, the yellow line that represents the women and the teal line that represents the men are more or less in line, and they basically start to diverge after about 10 years of experience. And this widens to the point of a maximum peak difference of 52K a year. Now, one thing that we wanted to do was to compare this information for people who work. This data is plotted for everybody who provided their income to us. So what we did was we filtered out the people who are working part-time or less than 40 hours a week. And I'll go to this next chart, which shows just people who are working full-time. And so if I flip back and forth between these two diagrams, you can see that the wage gap between men and women definitely narrows when you're considering just full-time employees. However, there is still an apparent gap of 47K at the 30 to 34 years of experience level, and a large gap in other years of experience as well, in other ranges as well. Another way to look at this is a pay gap by gender by position title. And so you can see here that the difference is less significant when you're comparing people at the same level, especially at the staff entry, the project engineer, and maybe the senior engineering level. But there is still a very significant gap at the principal level between the female and the male principals that we were able to survey. This gap is 52K. All right, so those are two examples of variables that we controlled for, but we sliced the data in many different ways, and we tried to control for as many variables as we could. So in addition to controlling for part-time status, employment status, and position title, we also looked at respondents who had children versus respondents who didn't have children. We looked at people who owned their own businesses or started their own businesses. we looked at firm size to see if this had an impact on the gap, and as well as geographic location, people who responded within California and outside. And what we found after controlling for all of these subsequent variables was that the pay gap persisted, the gender pay gap persisted, despite all of these subsequent filters that we applied to the data set. And so we are currently in the process, we mentioned that we're doing some follow-up work to the study in preparation for next year's 2018 study. And one of those things that we're doing this year in 2017 is a dedicated pay report to publish some more information about what we found in this data. So to summarize the key findings in the pay and benefits section, the effect of burnout is real. For each additional hour over 40 worked per week, the odds of an employee considering leaving are 4% higher. There is also a significant gender pay gap in our profession. Even when controlling for all of these subsequent variables and demographics, we still found the gender pay gap to persist.
So our last finding section is work-life balance in children. And we started by asking people, how satisfied are you with work-life balance, just generally? And we found that there was significant dissatisfaction, but you know, you can see the numbers up on the screen here. But really what we found with that is demonstrated here that was interesting is that people at the beginning of their career that are in the staff entry-level position and also people at sort of higher up in their career at the principal owner position, they were actually the people who were the most satisfied with their work-life balance. And our study didn't discuss the reasons for that explicitly. One might guess that might be because people sort of at the beginning of their careers perhaps have fewer obligations, maybe at work and at home, so maybe they're able to balance those a little easier. Perhaps also at the other end of the spectrum, when you're a principal or an owner of your own firm, you know, I'm sure you have many more obligations both at home and at work, but perhaps because you're the person in charge, you know, you can balance those a little better. So it was kind of an interesting dip that we see here at the associate shareholder level, where they have the least amount of work-life satisfaction with work-life balance, and that could be because maybe they have you know, a high level of responsibilities at home and at work, but perhaps not all the flexibility of a principal and owner. Again, that's all just sort of our guesses here, but this is what the data showed. And you might think, okay, well, you know, is it just that people who work fewer hours are more satisfied with work-life balance? Because that makes it easier, doesn't it? And that is true perhaps for the staff entry-level people, but you can see on this chart here that shows how many hours people work per week on average. For each position level, you can see that the principals and owners do work the most out of all the people we surveyed. So obviously there's some magic going on there. And they're doing a lot of work, probably doing a lot at home, but somehow still balancing it. So we need to figure out their secrets in our next study, perhaps. So we also asked people questions about having children and then also other people in their workplace who have children. And we did find that there was a negative stigma against employees who care for children and also against employees who use flexibility benefits, which sometimes are the same people. We asked people a variety of questions about this, and we found that respondents without children often feel, or sometimes feel, that they are left to pick up the slack for those who have children. They feel that they're expected by managers to work more hours, and they also feel that they actually do work harder than their coworkers who have children. So obviously there's room for improvement there as well. Looking at career advancement for people with children versus people without children, you can see that people with children were found to advance more slowly in their careers. In the chart on the right, you can see that, for example, to get to the senior engineer level, it took people with children 11.5 years to reach that position, whereas it took people without children only 8.5 years to reach that same position. But through all of this, through stigmas and people thinking they have to pick up the slack for people with children, advancing more slowly, all that, remember at the very beginning that Rose did note that one of the factors that correlated most highly with overall job satisfaction was having children. So, everybody go have babies, be happy. when we look at the breakdown of people who have children who took our survey, we see that at every position level, men were more likely than women to have children. You can see women are in yellow, men are in teal. But most notably, at the principal owner level on the right, you can see that 85% of male principals had children, while only 61% of women had children, female principals had children. And if everybody's ready for the most confusing slide in the presentation today, here it is. Perk up. Okay, so we asked people, how significantly have children affected your career? And we found, which is shown on this chart here, that of the 208 women who had children who responded to our survey, as shown on the left here, 32% of them said that children have affected their career significantly. Conversely, over in the bottom right, you can see that of the men who had children, just over half of them said that children had not affected their career at all. You can also see that there's people, across the spectrum for both genders, but those were the largest portions. You can also see on the bottom here, it's actually in kind of small numbers, so maybe you can't see, but what we also asked people, how much of the caregiving do you contribute in your household? And if your children are grown, how much of the caregiving did you contribute? And we found for both men and women that the more caregiving they contributed, the more significantly they would say that children have affected their career. And that was really most pointed at in the far left-hand column, where people say that children have affected their career, quote unquote, significantly. You can see that women reported doing 70% of the caregiving and men reported 45% of the caregiving, which is the highest amount for both men and women respectively, as compared to all the other columns here. So breaking out the information that we just touched on regarding domestic caregiving and what percentage people contribute, this chart shows the responses from both men and women in terms of how much they would estimate on average. This is kind of a hard number to estimate, I know, but so what this shows is how much people say that they have contributed to caregiving to their family. So you can see in the dark yellow column, we broke this down by ages, by sort of decades here. So you can see women in their 50s and 60s, they say when their children were young, they contributed 81% of the caregiving. Whereas women in their 30s and 40s, they contributed, in the low 60s, 62, 63% of the caregiving. And the women in their 20s who responded to their survey say that they do 54% of the caregiving. So the trend that we see from this is that women are at least reporting doing less of the caregiving, perhaps as sort of generations continue. Now, the men who responded to our survey kind of threw a little bit of a wrench in this, but you can see over in the right here, the men are noted in teal, and you can see that men from the age of 20 to well over 60 all generally report that they have done 35% of the caregiving. So they're very consistent, at least. It's worth noting that the people in the yellow are not necessarily married to the people in the teal. So, the information that we still gather from this is that we believe that women are reporting perhaps doing less of the caregiving, which means that any of these issues with children regarding stigmas and flexibility benefits and things like that are perhaps less and less correlated just to women's things and are affecting more and more men and women sort of more equally. Oh, briefly here, we also asked people what flexibility benefits they have available to them or would like available to them, and also which ones they do use. So you can see here that the biggest discrepancies, so benefits that they do use or would use are noted in yellow, and benefits that are offered to them are noted in teal. You can see that the biggest discrepancies between these two things are for place flexibility, weekly schedule flexibility, and parental leave with full benefits. And those are the ones where people, they would like to use them, but they're not offered to them. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there that obviously seems as though it could also use improvement. So doing a summary of some of the key findings for the work-life balance in children section, we found that employees with children advanced more slowly in their career than employees without children. However, they were more satisfied with their careers overall. We also noted that at every position level surveyed, female engineers were less likely than men to have children. And based on that last slide, couple slides we were talking about, men and women do appear to be sharing more of the domestic caregiving responsibilities today.
Okay, great. So that summarizes all of the findings that we have from our 2016 study. And now we're just going to spend the last 10-15 minutes talking through some of the best practices that were developed as part of this same study. So before we do, a few notes to make. Even though our group and our committee conducted a lot of outside research and collected a lot of outside studies related to the topics of engagement and equity, it was important for us, for this list of best practices to be developed directly from the findings that we were able to demonstrate through this data set. Next, we wanted to emphasize this multi-level approach. So whenever we start talking about practices that firms can adopt, there is this tendency for people to think that change has to come from the top down. But as we're going through these, we really try to emphasize ways that individuals can participate in enacting change within their firms and ways that organizations or leaders within those firms can enact change. So we really do believe that change can come from multiple levels and from multiple places. As we go through some of these practices, you will certainly feel that some of these are more difficult to implement than others. And so our suggestion to you, if you're listening to this from the perspective of what can I do, is to decide what's most important to you, which findings resonate most strongly with you, and what makes the most sense for you to start with. Certainly, it would be wonderful if everybody were to take these recommendations and go with them right from the start with all of them, but we understand that that's not necessarily practical for every situation in every firm. Lastly, I want to put a plug in here for a resource guide that our committee has developed, which summarizes the best practices and has supplemental research and guidelines that you might refer to if you're interested in. And you can find that resource guide on our webpage, which we will share with you at the end of our presentation. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first best practice, and we'll alternate as we have been doing. So the first best practice has to do with this finding related to poor management. We found that people who have left the profession cited poor management as one of their top reasons for leaving. And if you think all the way back to the section about career development, we also found that there's this disconnect between how managers and staff perceive their work environments, specifically how they perceive expectations and opportunities for advancement within their firms. And so we feel that this is a good baseline recommendation, which is to provide business management training to engineers. Certainly, people in general, anyone working within engineering or out, I think, can relate to this finding, which is we have all probably experienced firsthand the sometimes painful transition that an engineer can undergo when they go from being a technically minded person to trying to manage others and to doing more managerial activities. So this providing management training to engineers seems to be a great idea to tackle some of the issues that we are finding within the study.
So the next best practice is a somewhat seemingly simple one, at least conceptually. So one of the things, if you remember back in the beginning of this presentation, we mentioned 3 things that correlate highly with the high satisfaction with your career. One of them was aligning daily tasks with your career goals. So we thought, well, why don't we make that a best practice? Align tasks with career goals, great. So what this means, and Rose touched on this before, is essentially, if your goal in your career in 5 years, I want to be, an expert at designing hospitals or something, but I'm stuck designing anchorage for, whatever, school buildings every day for day in, day out, essentially, your daily tasks are not aligned with your career goals, and you're going to become less and less engaged in your profession. So this is actually an interesting one from the perspective of being top-down and bottom-up. What this requires is that each employee actually think about what are my career goals and figure that out sort of for themselves and communicate that to their management, and that management also take that and, act on it and perhaps assign assignments with those goals whenever possible. Obviously, it's not always going to be possible. Not every project is glamorous, but if that can be generally followed, we think that would improve engagement. Also, part of this, I think, is going to be reassessing the assignments and and the goals over time, because obviously as a person progresses through his or her career, those goals change. So just keeping in touch with that and keeping those aligned is one way that our study found that could perhaps keep people more engaged in their profession.
The next best practice has to do with mentorship. So we found in our study that respondents who did not have mentors were 22% more likely to consider leaving. So this is a pretty significant effect, and a lot of people think that providing mentorship opportunities is an easy way to tackle the issue of engagement and retention. So whenever you start talking about mentorship, there's a few different things to consider. If you want to create a workplace where everybody has access to a mentor, not necessarily, and this is either a formal mentor or an informal mentor, but it doesn't have to be a formal program that's established and assigned. Whenever people set up formal mentorship programs, there's always the complaint that, oh, I don't connect well with the person that was assigned to me, or, oh, I don't really relate to this person. And so the key is to ensure that everybody has access to one and everyone has a single person that they are able to go to for advice in their career, not necessarily that there's a one-to-one matching, that somebody has somebody assigned to them that they are supposed to go to for things. Another thing that we can talk about related to mentorship is whether you can go outside of your firm to find that mentor. Certainly through professional organizations such as SEA, we find that there's numerous opportunities for peer mentoring and also mentoring from the top down and bottom up. And so we encourage everybody, if you don't have the means to provide access to a mentor within your firm to everybody, our recommendation as a committee would be to at least encourage everyone to find a mentor outside of, and go outside of your firm if necessary to do so.
So next is this discussion about burnout, which we said, you know, respondents who worked more were more likely to consider leaving the profession, which was what we found in our data. So, you know, again, this is easier said than done, but curbing the culture of long hours is one way that we recommended that could help address this issue. I know that oftentimes we work on a project basis, and so sometimes we can't always keep our hours down. There are going to be times where probably we have to work more, but making it so that it's not a consistent thing, and it's not a day in, day out, always working a lot of hours, because that's what really seems to burn people out. And perhaps there are ways to adopt policies to improve engagement during periods of high workload where we keep people's interest up and know that they are supported during those times. And also this is something that can be addressed from an individual level by knowing your limits, knowing when to ask for help, and sort of managing it from that side so that you are not just given, you know, whatever you're given, you just think, oh, I have to do this. It's definitely a thing where you can sort of regulate this on your own from an individual level and communicate with your management, and hopefully from the management side acknowledge that that is an issue and address it as best as possible whenever possible.
The next best practice has to do with this gender pay gap. So we found in our study that there is a significant gender wage gap in our profession. And our recommendation to start down the road in tackling this issue is to perform an annual compensation audit. And I think it's important to note here that a lot of engineering firms of a certain size are already doing this annual audit for regulatory reasons, depending on what state you operate in. Different states have different regulations that you need to comply with. And so many places already have something in place to that requires you as an employer to demonstrate that you are providing equal pay for equal work. The one caveat to this that we hear over the course of this last 6 months that we've been presenting these findings to various audiences, we've heard of numerous firms, structural engineering firms, who are conducting this study within their companies to understand whether they have a wage gap problem within their firm. And a lot of times we hear from these firms that we looked at the numbers and there is no discrepancy. And so the issue here is that there's a difference between what kind of analysis you will be doing to demonstrate compliance with a regulation from your state, and the kind of analysis you'll be doing to see if there's an issue. And so you'll see in our study, all of our wage gap plots are demonstrated or plotted against number of years of experience. And so usually to demonstrate compliance when you're showing equal pay for equal work, a lot of firms get by with doing this by establishing a pay scale and saying that people within this pay level, within this position level, are being paid within this range, and that's how they demonstrate compliance. However, it doesn't factor in, it's kind of missing this one piece of the puzzle, which is, are people advancing at the same rate? Are men and women advancing at the same rate with the number of years experience? And so I add this in because we've been hearing a lot of feedback from engineering firms about conducting this study, and more often than not, we hear that there isn't a gap. And so we recommend to these folks to look into it a little bit more and to actually plot their data alongside their advancement data and to see if people are advancing at the same rate.
So the last two practices here are both somewhat related. So best practice number 6 here talks about work-life balance and flexibility. And we did find that there was some level of dissatisfaction with work-life balance among our respondents, and also that there were some flexibility benefits that employees wanted but were not offered. And there were also a few that were offered but not necessarily used. So the recommendation we form here is to create a robust and transparent work flexibility program and make sure that that program has input from staff regarding specific needs that they have, and really empower employees to use that. I think that flexibility programs are one of those things, I think they're still sort of developing in a lot of firms, and sometimes I don't know if they have, we don't know how much they have input from the people who actually use them, because obviously our study found a little bit of a disconnect. So perhaps more input could be provided by the actual people being able to use those benefits, but also empowering employees to use them. And this is another one that's sort of a culture-related item that's perhaps, can't just be implemented overnight, but this is part of the information that we presented before about stigmas for using flexibility benefits and that sort of thing. Empowering employees to use it is really showing that here are the flexibility benefits that are available. We know that they can be used to improve your work experience and your just general life experience, and we really want you to do that because we value you as an employee and we want you to stay here. So that is best practice number 6, and I'll just kind of tie in best practice 7 since it's somewhat related. Basically, this is related to the negative stigma that we found against employees with children specifically, and also that employees with children were found to advance at a slower rate than employees without children. So, the best practice here, and this is a somewhat probably our vaguest one, but we say providing comprehensive support to employees with children and dependents is an important thing to do. These are, a large portion of our workforce. They're also some of the most satisfied people per our study, per one of the findings that we had. So, they're worth keeping around, and if we can, whatever we can do to support them, whether it's evaluating and making sure that people are being advanced based on their performance and not necessarily just, based on if they're taking time off or have taken time off, stuff like that. But really looking at how these people are progressing through their career and if we can support them in flexibility and in other ways to make sure that they're getting a good experience and sticking around. So that is the end of our presentation just about here. You can see here that we've listed our website, se3project.org. Please check us out if you'd like to poke around and have a look at our full report or our best practices recommendations. We have a bunch of stuff on our website right now. We're also on LinkedIn and Twitter, which we update periodically. And please feel free to email us at se3@seonc.org if you have questions or want to get involved. And finally here, we just wanted to briefly plug some of our 2017 work. What we've basically done this year is broken out the committee into a variety of task groups to work on some of the some things that came up in our study last year that we thought would be important to look into further. For example, we were doing a dedicated pay report. We're basically taking all the survey data that we collected last year, and we do have a pay and compensation section in our report that came out at the end of last year, but we're doing a more in-depth review of pay. We're going to break it down by regions more thoroughly and really look at a lot more questions regarding pay because that was one of the things that people have a lot of questions about when they hear about this data. So we're looking into that right now. Another thing that we're doing is contacting people who responded to our survey last year. We asked people at the end of the survey, would you be willing to be contacted for a follow-up interview? So we are now doing that. We're going to be contacting people and doing just sort of in-person or over-the-phone interviews to just talk about personal experiences and sort of get more personal stories, because sometimes that can be more compelling than just data. We're also doing a best practices resource guide. We have some information on our website about this right now, but we're working to get even more information about that up in the next couple months here. We're working on a couple mentorship events that we're doing in the Bay Area, and we're also doing outreach to other similar groups that are doing similar activities, other WISE, Women in Structural Engineering groups, and other just engineering engagement and equity groups around the country. And also stuff like this, spreading the word about SC3 and what we're doing to people across the country who are interested. So that is that's our presentation. And
we'll move back to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We'll leave it on that one. So I think we're doing questions. We'll let the people there guide us.
So for reference, we still can't hear anything on that
end.
Yes,
we cannot hear you.
Just so you know, totally silent in our room here.
I've unmuted the room here.
There we go. Hi.
Okay, great.
We can hear you.
Do you want to take questions from the room?
Can you hear us okay? Yes, we can, but there's a strong echo.
How do we sound now?
Oh, that's much better.
That sounds better. Can you hear us?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, we'd be happy to take questions.
Chris? Yeah. So I have a question on the pay gap plot. You know how you guys have the one plot that shows kind of everybody and the pay gap, and then on the next slide you have full-time only? On the full-time only plot, is that always only full-time, or is that people that maybe went part-time to have children or take time off and then are now currently working full-time?
So this, I mean, the survey is a snapshot in time, right? So we asked people right then. So this question is how many hours, the question in the survey would have been how many hours are you working right now? So this would be like these people's current situation, and it does not relate to whether they had previously worked part-time.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else?
Sorry, anybody else? Were there any questions in the survey regarding either gender having a stay-at-home significant other?
Did you hear the question?
Oh, I guess. Well, we're conferring. I guess there weren't. We asked people if your household was dual income, but I suppose that the converse of that does not necessarily mean that the person is a stay-at-home person. So I guess we did not specifically ask that, right?
We didn't. No.
Yeah.
So when some of the graphs were up showing people with children and the men only being 30%, not being married to the pink boxes or the yellow boxes, they may have had a stay-at-home person, wife, whatever, or a spouse or significant other, I don't even know the terms to use anymore. The person may be at home that's helping assist with the child. You have to be politically correct. Partner. Yeah.
Yes, it's possible.
Curious if maybe the women had that, or only the men had that, or if it was equal amongst both genders, et cetera.
Yeah, and I guess
that's a great question.
I guess what we could correlate, yeah, but based on the data that we do have, is whether I'll say the amount of people, gender, who said that their household is a dual income household. I wonder if more women said that than men, or vice versa. I don't think we don't know the answer to that question, but I suppose we could find it out.
Yeah, it would be a similar thing to plot generational trends. I think it would be interesting to see how many people in their 20s and 30s who responded to the study do belong to dual income households and how many do not. So that would be interesting to look into.
I think to go along with that, the question would probably be the salary of the significant other also, because I can easily see that many male structural engineers may have a spouse with a lower income, that they're doing more of the caregiving.
And they may not even be working full-time either. If you
right,
say dual income,
hours.
Yeah.
Well, I think we did actually ask
what percentage of the household income you are contributing to. So we do actually have that number.
Anybody else? Do we have any online questions? No. Silent on the internet. Okay.
This isn't necessarily a question, it's more of a statement. For the best practices towards the end about the supporting people with children, I'd kind of like to recommend the converse of that, of maybe don't expect the people that don't have children to put in the long hours.
Right, and I think that's actually part of it, you know, improving the stigma against people with children, is making sure that there is a communication and a fairness and in reducing that perception, you know, such that people without children or dependents perhaps are not, you know, don't have to do significantly more or pick up the slack, you know, such that these things aren't even perceived and also obviously not real. I think that's really part of it, and some of the successful people that we've heard who are implementing policies that successfully to sort of address this have ways of improving communication amongst the team, where, you know, people with children have certain child care needs or whatever, you know, taking care of their parents, whatever the needs may be, are communicating with their partners in their own firm and making sure that everything is sort of taken care of, but that no one person is being overburdened, essentially, and, you know, making sure that all expectations are known and stuff like that. So I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, it's supporting by way of kind of supporting everybody.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, what Angie is saying is that communication between everyone on a team is important, but more than that, the base understanding here that we're trying to reinforce in best practice 6 and 7 is that work-life balance is something that everybody needs, whether you have children or not. And opening the lines of communication between staff who do and do not have children is a part of the process that you might undergo to try to create an environment where everyone feels comfortable taking advantage of flexibility that they need.
I have one question. How do you, I don't know if they can hear me, but how do you interpret having a wider range in salary at the principal level? What's your interpretation of that?
So we get that question a lot because that's the one that strikes a lot of people, that, you know, it's really jarring to see that even women who are at the principal level are still being paid less than their male counterparts. And so it has been suggested to us that numerous explanations for this, one being that women may tend to work at smaller size firms than men, and therefore are being compensated at a lesser rate, because I guess the inherent assumption there is that people who work at smaller firms aren't able to charge as high fees. So we looked into things like that. We also, there's another argument that says, you know, within that pool of men and women at the principal level, of which we had 400, almost 400 data points, the number of years experience within that pool is also slightly skewed, because we have a lot of older male principals who are responding than the younger female principals who are responding. So there's some of that, but there is still a gap when you control for the years experience within that one category, if you will. But the number that we're reporting there is across all women principals and all male principals that we surveyed.
And I think that's probably the largest reason.
That's probably the largest reason.
Because there's far more men who have been practicing longer, and many of the women principals are younger.
Yes. Remember, the number of years experience it took to advance to principal, on average for our survey respondents, was about 15 years for men and women. So it doesn't take long to advance to principal, but then there's a lot of men and women principals who have been doing it for varying years, varying numbers of years.
The other question I have is, how do we, I don't know if you have a response to that, answer to that, how do we compare to other industries?
So yes, we've gotten that question before, and we've looked at a variety of different studies related to satisfaction for let's say medicine and law and accounting, and so we've looked at studies that are just about employee satisfaction, but we've also looked at studies that cover the gender equity and the gender problem. And what we find is that, I guess this is to be expected, but we are in some ways better than those other professions, and in some ways we're not as progressive as we might think we should be. And it really depends on what specifically you're looking at, what you're comparing. It is difficult to draw lines of comparison between our studies and others, because every study is conducted slightly differently, the questions are asked differently, and so it's often difficult to compare apples to apples between these things.
And another thing that we actually found was that, or during just research, is that some research suggests that satisfaction surveys go up, people indicate being more satisfied when the economy is good, right? Which kind of makes sense. So so we had found some satisfaction surveys that were done sort of over time that really dipped in 2008 and then are, pretty much at a peak right now.
Yeah.
So, we did our survey last year, happy people, good economy, so, there's like, probably just infinite factors that go into,
Yes.
So, in one respect, a survey is a survey, and there are obviously limitations, but yeah, and especially when you start to compare to other things, comparing to a survey done 8 years ago, for example, might not be a very valid comparison. But yeah, it probably all depends how they ask their questions as well.
More questions?
What was the most surprising finding of the survey or the response of the industry to the survey?
That's a good one. I think that you'll find we have a number of people within our committee who have presented this to various audiences. And one thing I didn't mention in the very beginning when I said that we're a group of 20 to 30 engineers in Northern California, that's a bit outdated now, because in the last 6 months to a year, we've really grown to outside of our region, and we have people calling into our meetings from across the country, and it's much larger than 30 people now. So I bet if you ask any number of people who are involved in this project at the committee level, that everyone will give you a different response, because everybody's interested in slightly different things. But for me personally, I will say that my most surprising find in this was the finding about career advancement by gender, which is that how the data showed that women were actually advancing at a faster rate than men up until that principal level. That was very surprising for me to see.
Why do you think that is?
Well, so we're always cautious to keep ourselves within the limits of what our data can demonstrate and the scope of what the study can actually show. And so we want to limit the speculation, but I think that in my experience, women engineers are among some of the brightest and best and hardworking that I know. Not to say I also know many hardworking and talented and hardworking men engineers as well. But I do think that maybe women have a chip on their shoulder or something to prove, and so they're highly motivated to succeed, especially in the beginning of their career until other factors may take over.
So another thing that we thought could be a reason. And this is
it's a speculation.
Purely speculation that, like, Rose and I are individually contributing here. But, you know, we did a lot of the distribution, and this could actually affect the satisfaction numbers that we had, in my, again, personal opinion. A lot of the distribution that we did was through SEA organizations, both in California and nationally. And I think that it's more likely that people are more engaged in their profession when they're involved in, you know, these types of organizations. So perhaps we surveyed a very satisfied group of people, just kind of by, you know, I mean, it would have been great to get responses. And not everybody who responded was necessarily in SEA, but that was a large amount of our distribution. And perhaps you could deduce the same thing about women, is that the women who are involved in those organizations are also, you know, heavily involved in the industry, and perhaps sort of, you know, the people who are advancing perhaps more quickly in their companies as well. Totally speculation. Survey.
Yeah, the survey did not tell us that. Was there another question? We heard some other feedback.
How are you promoting the best practices? How are you getting this word out, and who's accepting the best practice suggestions?
So that's a current work in progress with our committee, and it's one of the ones that we are working hardest to achieve right now. So one of the means that we're getting the word out through are through presentations such as these. So we've probably given 10 to 15 of these at this point. We've participated in several conferences around the country, all engineering related, or I should say at large AEC related. And so at these presentations, we always receive follow-up questions about those best practices, and oftentimes we love to hear when people are actually in a position to do something within their firms and want to adopt some of these strategies. And so right now we have this subgroup that's working on outreach, and we have started to reach out to a number of organizations such as SCAOI, but even outside of the SCA member organization structure, we are thinking of or planning to approach firms individually to see if they want to learn more about this and to adopt some of the strategies within their firms. Of course, we are engineers by day and doing this as a volunteer committee effort, and so it would be wonderful if we could advertise our consulting services as, you know, best practice HR professionals, but that is not our area of expertise. We just happen to feel strongly about engagement and retention within this profession, and we want to do something about it. But yeah, that's the primary vehicle that we are communicating to others right now, these best practices.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Okay.